name is Tony Stephen. I get to be the minister here at the West Church. It's an absolute privilege, and you're incredibly welcome, whatever kind of week you have had. I'm going to invite Don Morrison to come straight forward. Don is responding, like an awful lot of us, to a situation, and has got ways that we can respond to that.
Something very unusual happened to me in church last Sunday. I'm not sure if you had the same experience. I was just listening to Tony's sermon on Luke 9, when Jesus commissions his disciples to go out and to preach and to heal. And he was telling them to have faith, not to take any coats with them, but just to go. And Tony was concluding his sermon by urging us all to respond, not just in words, but in deeds and in actions. And I found that thoroughly inspirational and galvanizing. So I have with me some forms, and I do hope if you feel that you can contribute, however small, in whatever way, if you could speak to me afterwards and just fill in your name and contact details, tell me what it is you think you could offer. That would be really wonderful.
Thanks to both of you. And as both of you mentioned, there are loads of you as individuals who I already know are registering and doing all sorts of things as well. So the more we hear, the more we can get involved. Do look out for Dawn. I don't know how you work out which one is Dawn to speak. That's Morrison's heart. I'm going to invite Kirsty and Denise and Emily to come here with me this morning. So, how we're organised locally in our church here is by something called the Kirk Session. The Kirk Session has a group of people called elders, who are the trustees of the church, who look after the overall vision of the church, and then also try and aim together to equip God's people here for works of service, to equip God's people for works of service involved. So for over a year now, actually, the three people who are standing here, Kirsty and Emily and Denise, have been coming along to our Kirk Session, getting involved and demonstrating that they're committed to working with us. So we're excited today to ordain them as elders here this morning. But before we do that, I've asked each one of them if you'd like to share either something that's an encouragement or something that's a challenge for them at the moment. And we'll just go with the order they're in. So Emily.
Did you see the way Denise just threw me under the bus there? I actually have a slide I want to look at, thank you. I feel I have a little bit of imposter syndrome happening today. I just really, it's funny, I think, how when we are involved in trying to seek God and trying to lead people in seeking God and things, we can feel like we're not holy enough, we're not good enough, or that there's reasons why we shouldn't be doing it. We all have reasons, personal reasons that we know about, secret reasons, maybe public reasons that make us inadequate or, that we don't deserve it or whatever it is. And so I have some feelings of that today, but what I want to do to challenge us, something that does challenge me and challenges all of us and excites me too, is if you look up at the slide here, for a while now, there's a group of us that have been doing something called Growing Young, and it's the Fuller Youth Institute have looked at lots of different churches and churches that are thriving, and they've started to identify patterns in what makes the church thrive and what makes it grow young as opposed to just growing old. And so these are some of the themes that they've realized that these churches all have in common. So you'll see there's best neighbors, keychain leadership, which is about handing leadership on to other people, younger people especially. Empathy today, this rhymes were really small for me. Taking Jesus' message seriously, warm relationships, and prioritize youth everywhere. And I think I said being the best neighbors. So I know that these themes may mean a lot or a little to you at the moment. I'm hoping that over weeks we'll understand them and will mean a lot more to all of us. There's probably different themes here that we all personally gravitate towards. You might find that warm relationships thrills you somehow, or Jesus' message, taking that seriously, thrills you. And we would love to hear what those things are that thrill you personally. But the thing that really challenges me as an imposter and as someone who follows Jesus is having a Jesus-centered community. And so one of the questions that came up when we were speaking about being Jesus-centered, one of the churches that has done this previously, I think it's a church in Aberdeen, but I can't remember. And their question was that they always put at the beginning of every meeting, every prayer meeting, everything that they do, absolutely everything, every coffee gathering they have, everything is there enough Jesus in this? And I love that question. And so my challenge and my thrill is for us to start asking ourselves that as a community, is there enough Jesus in this? Because really that's the heart of, he has delivered us from being imposters. And that's my heart, that's my thrill. I hope that wasn't too long. Sorry.
So one of my challenges that I've got at the moment is working with young people. I love working with young people. I work with Rock and Edge on a Thursday night to help Greg and Dawn. I've done time out in the past. I've taken groups away with Chloe and Tom Spencer to Soul Survivor. Absolutely loved it. So my challenge is to encourage other adults to get involved with our young people. They need good role models, good Christian role models, and my challenge is to try and encourage others to just get involved, to get in and be with our young folk. Thanks.
Hi everyone. I'd like to share a few words of encouragement in a challenge. Over the past couple of years, we have been living through various raging storms. The pandemic and many other storms. And so many of you here have also had major storms in your own personal circumstances. And now there's the hurricane of suffering in Ukraine and elsewhere in the world. Our soul can be crushed by all this. It's too much to bear. We were not made to stand despite relying on our own strength. We are reminded by Jesus about raging storms and our ability to endure it or to be crushed by the storm. Jesus reminds us that He is the rock who makes us stand firm through the raging storms. When we respond by listening to His teaching, and when we respond by doing what He teaches us to do, as we have already heard so far here this morning. The Jesus way of life gives us an unshakable foundation based on peace, hope, love, forgiveness, and truth. And relying on Him and not on ourselves. I personally am so encouraged by hearing what Jesus has to say to us through the teachings here at the West Church. I'm encouraged by the presence of the Holy Spirit in prayer and in our daily life. In reading the Bible, and also encouraged powerfully through meeting and praying as a community here and in small groups in Jesus' name. Thank you.
I'm going to invite the rest of the West Church elders to come and stand at the front with me. A round of applause at this point. Now our situation here is very good and very healthy, and you're incredibly generous. So a huge thank you again for all that you give in so many other ways, but also for the money that you give faithfully to the church year after year after year. Next slide. What we would like you to do, and we'll do the next one, keep that for another one, is add, as we ask every time this year, is really important for all of us, and I do this when I'm reminded in all the different ways that I give to the church and to various other charities, is to review the way that we give. And sometimes our personal situation means we have to give less, and that is perfectly fine. But it may be that we are in a position where we can give just a bit more, and in recognition that our costs are more and that we're investing in some incredibly important stuff, we would challenge everybody just to consider to review how much you give, and if you give regularly, perhaps you could give a little bit more. Also to consider giving regularly, because that really helps us to budget, particularly by a bank standing order, and if you can add gifting to that, that increases it even more at no cost to you. So if you want any more questions about that, get in touch with our office, get in touch either office@banchorywestchurch.com, treasurer@banchorywestchurch.com, and we can make all of that very simple for you. And if you at different times want to give towards particular things, that is fantastic as well. But we're all incredibly grateful, we're very privileged. God is faithful, and He really doesn't need us or our money to do the things He does, but it's a privilege to be part of that, so thank you. One more piece of news. As I listen, and I love to listen, absolutely love to listen, and mainly because I'm actually interested, partly because I'm really terrible at small talk, but as I love to listen, as I've listened over the last few weeks, months maybe even, what I hear is that people are weary, people are tired, people are feeling that they're expending more and more and having less and less to give. And it's no surprise, because the challenges that we're facing aren't single challenges, they're multiple challenges. So we've got the overlying stress of the information we're given about climate change. We've got the particular months and months now that we've dealt with the pandemic. And now we've got the highlighting of a particular conflict in Ukraine, but also a reminder of conflicts that have been going on all over the world and the effects of dealing with those. And I think for many of us, dealing with a challenge, in some ways we can get hold of that idea, because usually in our minds we have an image or a picture of a mountain, a hill, an obstacle, a hurdle, and that involves a rise in the challenge to a point where you get over and you start to see down on the other side, and you can see the end. But the sense for an awful lot of people, and I have started to use the word, and I've certainly heard the word a lot, and that is the word, is that things are relentless. That things go on, and it's very difficult to see an end, to see even a peak to the top of the hill or the mountain or the challenge, to see over the side and down. And that is burning us out. Now, many of us have heard the word burnout, have used the word burnout, experienced burnout in lots of situations and contexts. And those who would tell us about that through experience or research or writing or personal testimony will tell us that burnout tends to happen not because of extreme stress, but because of persistent, sometimes even low-level stress. We're all designed, it seems, for a certain amount of stress as part of being a human. It can be very positive in some ways. But unrelenting stress is what eventually burns us out. And in many situations, careers, personal circumstances at the moment, what we're facing is more and more to do with less and less resources. And yet, as I listen, as I see, as I live in this community, I see people keeping going, sacrificing themselves. Now, the Jesus story, the story of Jesus of Nazareth, is a story of sacrifice, a story of self-sacrifice. Next slide. Next slide. And his story, as we've started to wrestle with it in a book called Luke, in one of the 4 accounts of his life and his death and his resurrection, is a very short story in some ways. It only covers around about 3 years of his life. And in terms, some people might use, go to that image of living fast and dying young and burning out. But the Jesus story is in some ways very short, but in that time, it involves an awful lot of response, which is one of the reasons that we have used this image on the screens outside and here, of an invitation that demands a response. Because as we've seen Jesus start to wander around, start to gather a following and to stir up the crowds, he's demanded from all sorts of different groups a response, a very mixed response. He's gathered around himself, next slide, 12 young men. And next slide, the other way. Yeah, there we go. And they're known as disciples, students, learners. And for the first while, they have watched and listened to what he's doing and saying. And now, as we were introduced to last week in chapter 9, he's moving them from watching and listening to actually taking part in what he's doing. He says he's announcing some sort of project that God's always been involved in, and now they're involved in as well, putting things back together. And he sent them out to actually take part in that. Regularly, he pauses himself to communicate, to listen, and to talk with his Father, God, in prayer. And after a session of doing that, here in chapter 9, he then comes to his 12 young disciples and he asks them a question. He says, "Who do the crowds say I am?" And if that question seems familiar, it is, because last week we heard about the king, the puppet king of the time, the Jewish king Herod, asking the same question, next slide, which he himself was hearing things about this Jesus, and he was asking himself, who is this that I'm hearing things about? And he rehearsed some of the rumours of the time. And the disciples, when they answer Jesus, they do the same thing. Next slide. They replied, well, some folk are saying that you are John the Baptist, John the Baptizer. Now, he had gone around teaching people quite subversive things at the time and challenging the powers of the day. And Jesus was saying something very similar. Other people were saying that Jesus, because he taught such things that were criticising the powers of the day, that this is in the tradition of men who had come before and they had a message, usually for the whole country or for those in power, usually about how they had to turn things around, and they were known as prophets. And so they mentioned Elijah, one of their hero prophets, or just the fact that Jesus might be a prophet, or one of the ancient prophets come back to life. Jesus then, next slide, asks them directly. So they've seen what he's been about, they've taken part in what he's doing, and now he wants to challenge them to respond by asking them, okay, fair enough what everybody else says, what do you say? Who do you say I am? And Luke, of course, he's our storyteller, he's collecting this material together, he wants us to be asking ourselves the same question. Next slide. He demands from them a response. One of Luke's themes is the response to Jesus, that no one is neutral around him. Next slide. Peter, one of the older disciples, we think, he seems to be the representative who speaks. And his answer is that you are God's Messiah. Now, you may have heard the word Messiah used in all sorts of different contexts. You may have been involved a little bit in learning a little bit about the Jewish scriptures and wrestling with them. And so you may have an idea of what a Messiah is. The word Messiah is a Hebrew word. Next slide. It means anointed one, literally. And the word in Greek is the word Christ. So the word Messiah and the word Christ are just the same word, meaning the anointed one. And an anointed one was a priest or a prophet or a king. That's how they became into that position. And so when Peter says, you are God's Messiah, there's that running around. But at the same time, over the last few hundred years, in fact, an idea had grown up that a Messiah was going to be a figure that would come into the Jewish situation and sort things out for them. And for them, that meant somebody who was going to get rid of the Romans. And so they were really looking for the popular opinion of the time, a warrior king. Next slide. I think that's what it says. Yeah, a warrior king. That's what they were hoping, someone who would put things to rights. So that would mean getting rid of the people who were oppressing them, caused them to be in slavery and then out of their country, and now we're still grinding them under their boots. And instead replace them, ideally with a Jewish empire. Surely that was the right way for things to go. Peter has given an answer. And Peter has given an answer that is more than the crowds and the rumours. Next slide. He's saying, Jesus is not just a prophet, he's not just a teacher, he's not just even a wonder worker or somebody who is doing something interesting. He is more than that. And he said, Herod asked the question, Jesus asked the question, and now Peter gives the answer. You are God's Messiah. So at this point, Peter is doing exactly what Luke wants. Luke wants people to always think that Jesus is more. And at this point, Peter might think that he is top of the class, that he's got the right answer. But then, of course, Jesus pulls the rug out from under his feet as he then goes on to describe a little bit more. Next slide. Jesus talks about someone called the Son of Man. And again, that would be okay, because this idea of a Son of Man comes from another of their inspirational books of hope called Daniel, where one who is like a son of man stands beside God and then is given authority to start to sort things out, which exactly is the idea of this warrior king that would be. But then as Jesus goes on, he describes this son of man figure suffering. And that's not what the popular hope was. And being rejected by the Jewish system, the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law. And then being killed. And then here, on the third day, being raised to life. Now, I don't know how many of you work your way through box sets or long novels, but it's not great practice to give a spoiler like this in chapter 9 of a much, much longer book. The kinds of things he's saying are not what people are expecting of a Messiah, and they're certainly actually not what most people are actually wanting from a Messiah. Peter may have said the right words, and he may have an understanding that is far more than those who are talking about Jesus. But what Jesus then says is going to shock his followers. Next slide. Their response, like so many around, is really mixed, and that's why we've got this image of closed hands resisting and slightly more open hands wondering about receiving something in a different way. This is not what they were expecting, not what they were hoping for. They had 400 years of not being the people they want to be, and the last thing they want is more suffering. And so this is playing with all their expectations. Next slide. Jesus goes on, and he talks about being a follower, and what that is like and what this will be like. He says that my disciples must deny themselves, take up their cross daily and follow me. And then he talks about saving lives and losing lives. These are actually images, particularly the image of the cross, that his listeners would be incredibly familiar with. The cross was the Roman method of execution for enemies of the state. It was used time and time again, right across the land, in all sorts of different ways, to stamp down on rebellions, and then very publicly, as the corpses stood, hundreds of them lined along the road on the crosses, showing people what happened to those who went against the Greek and the Roman Empire. Next slide. Jesus takes that image. He also takes the image of life, and losing life and saving life. And as he talks more about it, we get the sense that instead of just physically being alive or dead, he's actually talking about a kind of life. And he seems to describe two kinds of life. One is the kind of life that the culture of the time is trying to tell everyone they should be involved in. A kind of life that is completely self-centered, about consumption, about power, about behaving, about always focusing on yourself at the expense of everyone else. And he describes that as a very empty kind of life. The opposite kind of life is the kind of life that God made us for, and he's going to say a lot more about that. And it seems what he's saying is, when people are asked to carry their cross, and in actual fact, if you were condemned to crucifixion, one of the parts of the process is that you had to carry a huge piece of wood towards your execution site that would then be involved in that. It seems to be that Jesus is using this idea and saying that his followers are going to actually have to crucify the idea that the culture is trying to tell them about what their life should be like. That's the impression of denying themselves, about putting to death this idea that this is who they were made to be, and instead embracing a different kind of life. Next slide. He talks about what good is it for someone to gain the whole world. And this image is one that Luke and others play around with, this idea of the world. And often when they use that word world, they actually mean the world that's in rebellion, the world that's actually going against the way things God has created and the way God has made things to be. He said, what good is it for you to gain the world that the Greek and the Roman Empire would tell you to have? And an awful lot of people listening to him, that's exactly what they want. A bit of security, a bit of money, a bit of pleasure, a bit of consumption, a bit of ways of looking better than everyone else around it. He said, what would be the gain in that? If you gain the whole of what this is being sold to you, this empty, fake world, but at the same time you lose, and the way the translation puts it is beautiful actually, not just your life, but your very self. The kind of life you were made for, who you were made to be. And the way he describes that is a way of living that is about giving yourself away. It's about living for the people around you and the creation and being part of what God is doing. And for him, that is worth denying all the rest and putting to death those ideas. Next slide. He has described, and he's hinted at different ways about this whole project and calling it the kingdom. Not a warrior kingdom, but a kingdom which is the world the way God made it to be. And when he tells them that surely some of them standing there will see and taste that before they physically die, he is saying, I believe, that this is breaking in right now. In him, in his life, in his death, and his resurrection, there'll be a climax to that on that cross, and then on the third day with that empty tomb. But this is God at work already. And what seems unending is not unending, because there will be another side. There will be a time when things are put back together, and God has his creation project back on track. But why? Why would you give up so much? Next slide. As I listen, and I love to listen, because I'm interested, and because I'm terrible at small talk. As I live in this community, I see and I hear you doing this every day, giving yourselves away at the expense of your own health and your own well-being. Parents to children, grandparents to grandchildren, nurses, doctors, teachers, engineers, managers, care workers, shop assistants. Literally bearing the scars of what they are giving up for each other, burning yourselves out. And I believe that all of us, with faith or not, are doing this because we know somewhere deep in our bones this is what we're made for. The world doesn't understand it. But this is what we're made for, and what I believe Luke is telling us, and what I believe Jesus' life and death and resurrection is telling us, that we're doing that because that is what we were made for. And that will not be without end, because we have a God who has and who does completely give himself away in the same and far more sort of sacrifice for us, and who promises with something we can trust in, that there will be a time when everything is put back together, and there will be another side to the hurdle, to the obstacle, to the mountain. The same kind of God who also says, next slide, come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Let's just take a couple of minutes to pause, to reflect, to respond.